Space settings are important to understand when you're setting up your documentation space. That's what we're going to look at in this segment. We'll look at the space key and space name, along with space categories, space permissions, and finally making a space publicly accessible. First, we'll look at the space key. A space has a unique and immutable key. This means that you can't have the same space key across multiple spaces in one instance. You can't change the space key using out-of-the-box Confluence functionality. The important thing to remember here is to create a key that's clear and easy to understand so that you can avoid the difficulties entailed in trying to change it in the future. If you look at the URL for content in a space, you'll see that it consists of the space key and the page name. So there's no problem in changing the space name, but you can't change the space key. So make sure that you create space keys that don't need to be updated. Make sure that the space key isn't, for example, inadvertently offensive or inappropriate. With space names, there are fewer restrictions. If you do have to change the space name in the future, there are some things to bear in mind. One thing is that your page links will continue to work, even though now their address is somewhat different. This might cause a little confusion, so whenever possible, try to use a future-proof space name. You can also give your space a space category using labels. Space categories are useful because they create a taxonomy for space type. They allow you to group together similar sorts of content, like documentation. This will help you to navigate to your space from the space catalog in Confluence. Categories are often used in third-party apps, and you can use them in some Confluence macros to help surface content. Next, we'll review space permissions. First, let's consider the different levels of permissions that are available. With global permissions for Confluence, you're able to set up who can access Confluence, who has administration access, and who is able to create a global space or a personal space. Permissions are also applied at a page and at the space level. At a page level, you can restrict who can access or edit a page. Let's look at page-level permissions first. At the page level, you can set restrictions on who can edit the page and who can view the page. You'll know if page permissions have been added because a red lock icon has been applied to the page. Notice here that we have view-level permissions added. This particular restriction means that only Emma Rush, David G., and Robert Marshall can view the page, and nobody else. Robert Marshall is only able to view the page, he is not able to edit it. You should also be aware that page view permissions are inherited by child pages. In contrast, page edit permissions are not inherited. For documentation, edit restrictions are very necessary, so that only designated editors of your documentation can update content, rather than allowing editing by all of the Confluence users who can access the space. For both edit and view page permissions, you limit access to the content to individual users and groups of users. It's a good idea to add restrictions on content that is not yet approved to limit page access to reviewers and approvers. For example, you might add a new page of documentation which needs to be reviewed and then approved before it's made available for general consumption. Add view or view and edit restrictions during this stage. Then, when the content is approved, you can remove the restrictions to make the content visible to all of the people who have access to the space. Space-level permissions are far more granular than global permissions. They control the following: the ability to add content to the space, edit all pages in the space, delete any page in the space, add comments to pages in the space, and administer the space. An efficient way of managing the space is to create two user groups. In this case, since the space name is documentation, we'll add documentation to the user group name that we will allow access to the space. We'll have two groups, documentation users and documentation admin. We'll add only those users who will perform space administration to the documentation admin group. The space administrator can control access to the space by selecting user groups or users and allocating them permissions in the space. One thing to note is that space administration should be constrained to a limited number of users rather than many, especially when the space is for documentation, which needs to be managed very carefully. Another important consideration is related to the delete permission. You should consider granting this permission carefully, because you don't want people to be able to delete valuable content and then have it lost. Of course, it's possible to retrieve that content from space trash if you're an administrator, but consider the administration overhead of having to retrieve deleted content frequently. Also, content might get completely removed from the trash by purging it, and you would then have to sift through Confluence backups to retrieve it. It's often the case that your documentation needs to be accessible to the public who use your product. Of course, you could insist that users sign up and get an account so that they can access your documentation. This would be useful if you need to manage access to your Confluence instance carefully. However, it's often the case that you'll have thousands of users of your product, and the cost of a large number of licenses, along with the administrative overhead of managing all those users, might be prohibitive. Let's look at how it's possible to allow access to your Confluence instance without signing in. First, let's consider the impact of allowing public access into your Confluence instance. Then we'll look at how you can actually allow public access via Confluence Global Administration and Space Administration. Security is a big concern when you're allowing access to your Confluence instance. If you decide that you'll allow one or two spaces to be accessed by users who are not signed in, then you need to remember that accidents can happen, and maybe a less experienced space administrator will accidentally give public access to a space intended for internal use only. And what if there was very confidential information in that space? One way to get around this is to have your main Confluence instance be available to all your employees, and then have another Confluence instance that's designated to allow non-signed-in users access. You can limit internal employees' access to the external-facing instance to only those who need to administer content in that instance. This approach does mean you'll have extra expense and adds the second Confluence instance to your company's infrastructure. If you choose this setup, one way you can save some administrative overhead is to use one of a number of apps available on the Atlassian Marketplace that will allow you to easily publish a space from one Confluence instance to another. We'll look at how to set up a publicly accessible space in the next demo. Finally, an observation. You might think that allowing commenting on the content would be a good idea, but only allow this if you're managing your content very, very carefully, because people could add comments that are unwelcome, argumentative, or advertising their own products or services. So how can you communicate with your end users to make sure that they're getting the support they need and that their valuable feedback is being taken into consideration? You can provide a link in the documentation to your support application. And what is the ideal support application for Confluence? Jira Service Desk, of course. In the final segment, we'll show you how to do that. So we've just looked at space settings. We'll do another demo, then after that, we'll look at how you can improve user consumption of content through page layout and use of macros. In this demo, we'll look at how to make your space publicly accessible.
In this demonstration, we will look at how to make your space publicly accessible. First, as a Confluence administrator, you need to go to the General Administration area, choose Global Permissions, then go ahead and click Edit Permissions. Then check the Can Use option for allowing anonymous access. Here, you also have the option to allow anonymous users the ability to view user profiles. Since this is in the context of using Confluence for documentation or as a knowledge base, it is unlikely that you'd allow access to the whole of the Confluence instance, so you'd most likely not allow the anonymous users the ability to view user profiles in order to maintain privacy. Next, select Save All. Then, you'll need to go to the space you're allowing access to, and, as a space administrator, click on the Space Tools icon and select Permissions. Here, you'll then need to scroll to the Anonymous Access section and select edit permissions. You'll then need to decide how people can interact with your content. Unless this is a very open product, you should really limit how people interact with your content. In this case, I'm only allowing view access to the content. Select Save All. Now, if I log out as an administrator, I can access the Confluence instance as a non-logged in user. You can see that I am not logged in here. Since I've allowed public anonymous access to the space, you can see that I can view the show space I created earlier. And then from the left-hand navigation for the site, I can view the page we created. A couple of things to note when dealing with anonymous users. You can't grant space admin or restrict permissions to anonymous users. There are, of course, many security considerations when allowing external access to spaces in your Confluence instance, so be aware and allow access with care. And that brings us to the end of this demonstration on allowing public access to your Confluence page.